All right. Hi. Hi, beautiful people. If you are watching me on the replay, thank you so much for watching me. I appreciate you. If this is your first time joining me, my name is Celeste. I'm a therapist from Boston. I come on Wednesdays to talk about issues that we deal with and then kind of help us think about ways that we can navigate it. Last week, I forgot what we talked about last week, but we talked last week. I believe we talked about the environment and how it plays a role in your life. So these podcast episodes stay on my social media platforms, but you can also listen to them on my audio platforms of YouTube, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud. Anywhere you're listening to podcasts, you can listen to this. Today, we're talking about relationships, one of the most complicated things that people struggle with. And because I get to work with people, I understand that people have no idea why relationships are so hard. And I'm not just talking about romantic relationships. I'm also talking about your friendships, your family relationships, coworkers, all of it. So we're going to kind of navigate through it. So if you feel like relationships are very complicated for you and you found yourself struggling in it, I'm going to help you navigate it. So if you are watching this, make sure you like, share, or subscribe. So first, let me pull up my slides. Hey, Kat on YouTube. I've been following you since your Twitter account. You've even helped me with a tricky time in my life and listen to my email. You are so gentle. Oh, thank you, Kat B. I appreciate you. I know she says it's my Twitter account because I'm not really on there as much as I used to in the past. But I used to be on Twitter a lot. So I know you've been following me forever. So when we think about relationships and the complexities of the relationships, I want to start with triggers because triggers are such a huge thing that people don't realize can come up in your relationship. And I find that when it comes to the triggers, they show up more in relationships. People don't realize this, you know? I always say, like, if I didn't know how to read, if I didn't know my alphabets, I wouldn't know how to read, right? And I think about mental health and I think about the way we're trying to navigate life. Most of us don't understand ourselves, we don't understand our history. And so that makes it really hard for us to navigate these different relationships. So it feels like we're failing. Sometimes it feels like something's wrong with everyone else, or sometimes it feels like there's something wrong with us. So hopefully, by the end of this broadcast, you'll be able to have a better sense of how you can work on navigating relationships. So the first thing that's so important when it comes to relationships is understanding triggers, because triggers in relationships are huge factors. The first thing about the triggers that I want you to think about is unpleasant memories. So triggers can be an intense reaction to present situation that reminds you of something painful and unresolved. So let me explain that. So when it comes to things that have happened in the past, I'm sure everyone's heard this. And if you haven't, there's a statement, a book actually called The Body Keeps the Score. So a lot of times people don't understand. Let's say your parent betrayed you and would say, like, hey, I'm going to come see you and never come, right? That feeling of betrayal is something that will stick heavily in your system without you realizing it, because let's say you're an adult and you may be over it, or maybe you've reconciled with that parent, whatever, right? That betrayal piece is going to be heavy for you. Now, when we fast forward to, like, let's say a friendship, let's say a friend said, hey, I'll meet you at 5, and something came up and they couldn't meet you at 5. What could possibly happen is that you may feel some type of way towards that friend, not realizing it. When that person said, I can't meet you no more at 5 o'clock, it felt like a betrayal, right? Did they betray you? No, I wouldn't say it was a betrayal, but it can feel like a betrayal, especially if they've communicated that with you. And so what will happen is you start struggling with that friend, not realizing it's because of that feeling, that intense feeling. I always say if the feeling doesn't match the situation, check yourself, because it's probably something deeper. And this happens all the time, where something in the past, an emotion in the past, will trigger something deeper. I always like to pull up this emotion wheel, because this is important. A lot of times people don't understand their emotions. And this is actually from an organization called Beam. They have really good free content online, where this is different feelings that you can go through and not realize that it's happening. I was just discussing my triggers to my husband. He wants a list of them. Yes. And okay, so thank you. Yeah. And in your romantic relationships, it shows up the more, it shows up way more. So not only it's good for your partner, especially when you're in a relationship, to understand your triggers, but it's also good for us as individuals to understand our triggers, because we can't help it if somebody is doing things that is triggering us. We can only be able to identify it. Let's say it's something that you have no control over. So that's why it's really important to understand. So the first thing I said was thinking about those unpleasant memories and how they can play a role in your present. The second thing is insecurities. So you might have a higher expectation of the people you open your heart to. And when you say or do things that hurt you, when they say or do things that hurt your feelings, it can hurt more. So the expectations, especially when it comes to romantic relationships, we don't realize we have these explicit and explicit expectations about the way we think it should look like. We also sometimes can tend to have expectations on not just what it looks like, but for them to understand us, right? Like if you've been together for a while, well, you should know this. There's this mindset of what should happen, as opposed to, you know what, let me communicate this. I was definitely notorious. I used to feel like, well, why don't you know, right? Because when you have these intense emotions, it can feel so real. And maybe your partner, your coworker, your friend may not appear to be responding as if they care or understand. And so that lack of the feeling of validation can hurt you really bad. It can feel really hard to understand. So when you're thinking about triggers in these relationships, think about what you may be expecting of them. And also, sometimes we have unrealistic expectations, right? We may have a friend that shows up all the time for us, and another friend that we may party with, and that party and friend we're asking to show up for us in a certain way that they may not even have the capacity. A parent, right? You think about a parent's role according to what it's supposed to be. As a parent is supposed to take care of you. A parent's supposed to listen and be there for you. And sometimes, as we get older, and we may start to recognize that we want more from a parent that they're able to give. In those relationships, especially when it comes to family, a parent or a kid, we may have to grieve the relationship that we wanted so that we can accept what it is. Because if you have expectations for somebody that doesn't have the capacity to fulfill them, you're going to always find yourself feeling hurt and it feeling very complex, right? That parent relationship, that friend relationship that you may want more out of them. People want more out of those relationships because they're giving more, right? So being mindful of how much you're putting into the relationship. It's not about being a tit for tat, but being mindful of that. Also, when it comes to triggers, unfulfilled expectations, you might be triggered when somebody's behavior doesn't meet your expectations, kind of like what we just talked about, right? Really being mindful of what you're expecting and if they're not fulfilling it. And at some point, you got to take the responsibility and recognize that I'm looking from them, more from them than they're able to give. I have to pay attention to how I show up, right? A lot of times we're not doing that. We're just showing up the same way and expecting a different result, right? Your critical inner voice, that's important. The voice is formed from negative experiences in early life, such as being told things or witnessing attitudes. You may have had a parent that was a single parent, came home snappy all the time. And so you always felt like something's wrong, right? You could be in a relationship with somebody and they may have had a hard day and nothing against you, but then you may start to feel your inner voice might start to say, oh my gosh, they're mad at me. Oh my gosh. Um, I'm doing something wrong, because maybe as a child you felt like you always did something wrong or you always got in trouble, right? These are just examples I'm utilizing. It's important to be mindful of the critical inner voice in your head, right? Because you don't want to give yourself a narrative that may not be true. Just because when you were growing up, maybe your parent or caregiver came in upset or things had to be a certain way. And so as an adult, you find yourself looking at people's actions in the same way, where maybe that may not even be the case, right? It's so important to be mindful of the way you're viewing things. The last thing around triggers when it comes to relationships is really understanding your attachment history. Your past experiences can leave emotional imprints on your brain, making you more susceptible to emotional triggers, right? So if you grew up in, let's say you have abandonment issues, where let's say a parent wasn't available to you, whether literally or emotionally, and you're in a relationship and you might find yourself looking for that partner to be that everything. Or let's say that partner decides they're with you all day, and let's say they want to go hang out with their friends. That inner voice in you may start to say, oh my gosh, they're trying to leave you. You don't even realize it's happening. And you find yourself picking a fight or having a hard time with your partner leaving. Hey, Ursula, right? You may have a hard time with your partner leaving because it feels like they're abandoning you. When the reality is like they're just trying to go out and have fun with their friends. But because of your past experiences, it can feel that way, right? So these are just some examples on the different kind of triggers and relationships that can come up for you, and really being mindful of identifying them so that you're not creating more conflict in a relationship that needs to be in that relationship. So the next thing is like really being able to identify the different type of relationships, right? We have family, we have friends, acquaintances, work, romantic. A lot of times we unfortunately can find ourselves grouping people in the same category, especially when it comes to friends, right? There are different type of friends. The capacity of your friendships may look differently. What I find is that people that are givers, uh, that are very kind-hearted, very giving, find themselves doing it across the board. And so some of these people that you call friends may not really be friends, or maybe you need to identify what a friendship looks like, or what would I want my friendship to look like, right? Because if you don't do that, you might find yourself feeling disappointed about their ability to show up for you in ways that you may want them to show up, right? So when it comes to family as well, the idea of family, it sounds great depending on the way you grew up. But unfortunately, sometimes family systems can be broken, where they may not show up for you, or you may have a hard time being in the presence of family. And so you have to ask yourself, yes, they're family, but maybe this is one of those things that I might need to do from a distance, where I love them from a distance. Maybe this is one of those things where I can't show up to certain events because I recognize they're going to tease me. They're going to tease me for picking a healthy lifestyle, or they're going to, or this or that's going to happen. A lot of times we grew up hearing blood's thicker than water, right? We got to stick by blood. And so there are a lot of people in family relationships that are struggling, and you have autonomy over your life, but because it's so ingrained in you to stick with family, you're allowing so much unnecessary things to take place, and the relationship feels complex and complicated, right? So, in those cases, I really want to challenge you to be mindful of what you allow. I always tell people, anytime you're waiting for people to change and for you to feel better, you're putting your healing in their hands, and that's never okay. And I understand trying to change the way you've been, especially when it comes to family, especially when it comes to friends, can be really complicated. But it's really important to try to do that, but so you're not waiting for that healing to take place. So identifying your relationships is important. Communication, right? When it comes to navigating complicated relationships, being mindful of your communication. So when you're communicating with people, make sure you're actively listening to them. Using I statements, especially if you're struggling with them around something, these statements can help you communicate your feelings, needs, and concerns without sounding threatening or blaming. Be aware of your tone when you are talking and communicating with people. Addressing misunderstandings, I want to pause there for a second. Addressing misunderstandings is something that is really hard to do, especially if you look at conflict in a negative way, right? If you're somebody that thinks of conflict as like, oh my gosh, something's going to happen. If conflict growing up has been something that's been challenging for you, trying to deal with the situation can feel challenging. Like your system might try to reject you from doing it. You might find yourself feeling anxious about having that conversation, right? But I promise you, if you continue to avoid the conflict that's happening outside of you, you're just asking for the conflict to be internal, right? And so I understand the idea of having a hard conversation feels hard in the moment. But I promise you, what feels harder is avoiding that conversation and dealing with the way that things are just as they are. So, really being mindful of that. And then when it comes to communication, be honest and respectful. Choose the right time to bring up conflict, especially in relationships. Like we may have something on our mind, and we want to be heard right away, and maybe the partner's not ready to hear, right? As hard as that is, right, where you're steaming and want to get it out, as hard as that is, you have to be patient, because it doesn't make sense trying to have a conversation with somebody that's not ready to have that conversation, right? So really being mindful of that. The last two things I want you to think about when it comes to navigating the complexities of relationships is the importance of setting boundaries. Setting boundaries will expose the toxicities in relationships. So setting boundaries in a relationship can help build trust, respect, and can help you take responsibility. So when it comes to boundaries, communicate, let others know what you're tolerating, what you won't tolerate. A lot of times we're struggling with people because of what they're doing. They're always asking me to do something, right? If I'm not clear with them that, hey, I don't have the capacity to do this, they're going to keep asking me. I have to be clear and say it. And I understand sometimes being clear and assertive is hard to do, especially if you haven't been taught, especially people when you grew up in certain family systems where you were just told what to do, how to do it, when to do it. And then it's like, hey, I'm 18 now, and now you're supposed to figure out how to navigate life. That's really hard to do. So really being mindful of making sure that you are communicating your needs. Being assertive is important. People are more likely to respect your boundaries if you communicate them confidently and clearly. So, not maybe I'll try to see what I can do, knowing you can't do it, right? I would say, I can't do that now. I don't think I can do that. Maybe I'll try, right? Because it feels hard. Think about this. If you don't have the capacity to do something, and you're doing it anyway, you're literally telling yourself no. The person that should mean the most to you is yourself, right? You should have high regards, high respect for yourself. You should really love yourself in a way that feels good. So for you to tell other people yes and tell yourself no, you're not being fair to yourself. Think about the person that you love, a friend, family, cousin, a little kid. Would you give them that advice, right? That's the thing I ask people to help them understand what they're doing. I'll say, if your daughter came to you and said, "Hey mom, I don't have the capacity to take my friend to work, but she really needs me to take her to work, but it's going to put me in a crunch." Would you tell her, "You know what? Go ahead and take her to work," right? 10 times out of 10, people will say, no, you got to do what you have to do. It's a lot easier for us to express a hard boundary to help someone else out than it is for us. And so why does that happen? Why is it so hard for me to like set these hard boundaries when I know I don't have the capacity? That happens because your system hasn't learned a different way. You were never taught, right? And so the amazing things about being a human being is that we can recalibrate our system. But trying to recalibrate our system can be really complicated. It can feel like we're doing something wrong. And so, as you're trying to recalibrate your system, you have to have internal dialogue to remind yourself, like, you're not doing anything wrong. Everything's going to be okay, right? I'm doing this because I love myself. Even if you don't feel it, you really got to like start to say it. And then as we're thinking about boundaries, thinking about your time boundaries, that's important, your emotional boundaries, and then like other boundaries, like codependency, personal space, disagreement. For example, you can ask for quiet when you're working or leave a situation if someone's being disrespectful, right? I really want you to be mindful on what you allow in relationships because we can't change other people, right? If somebody's going to keep asking me to take them to work and I know I can't, and I promise you, people will use people that allow themselves to be used, right? They'll be like, oh no, I'm not going to ask this person because I know they're going to say no, right? They know not to ask that person for $100, or they know not to ask that person because they have hard boundaries. And sometimes people with hard boundaries may be looked at as difficult, right? And so you don't want to be looked at as difficult, but does it matter what it looks like to you if you're the one dealing with the ramifications of your boundaries being overlooked, right? Those boundaries are there to protect you. And so if you don't like name it, if you don't uphold it, people are going to walk all over you. Doesn't mean that they're bad people because they're always asking you for $100 or always asking you for a ride to work. They're not bad people. You just set the relationship up that way, right? And so as you're trying to change what that looks like, they're going to have a hard time with it, right? It's going to feel hard. You're going to feel like you're doing something bad. But that's because your system is like, whoa, 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 what are we doing, Celeste? We give out the $100. We give out the ride. It doesn't matter how much capacity we have. That's what happens to your system. It's literally learning a new way of operating. I always use an example. If you had a bad heart and you needed a heart transplant, it's going to take, as bad as your heart is, like the heart's bad, it's like 20%, right? You get a brand new heart, which is like optimal level, it's still a foreign heart. And so as the body is trying to accept this new thing in its life, even though it's operating better than the 20% heart, it's going to take time for it to acclimate. There are things that people can't do. There's medicines that they have to take. There's therapies that need to happen in order for the body to get acclimated to the heart. Literally what happens, and when we're trying to adapt and adopt new ways of operating, is that our system is trying to get acclimated kind of to the new ways of operating. Someone says being the yes ma'am makes saying no difficult. Even setting boundaries and sticking to them um can be I'm assuming can be really hard. So yeah, when you've been known to be the yes man, just know that people are going to know like they can do that. And as you are trying to change, like be patient with yourself during that process. The last thing I want to talk about really quick is managing conflict. So accepting conflict, like being mindful, try to get used to like, what conflict is a part of life, being calm when you are in the midst of conflict, listening actively, analyzing the conflict, using neutral language. So try to separate the person from the problem, work together. Sometimes it's one of those things that you got to agree to disagree. Um, when you are in the middle of conflict, avoid blaming, accusing, or criticizing. It's easy to when you're in the thick of conflict, it's easy to be like, well, you did this and just talk greasy and dirty to that person. It doesn't help anything, right? Um, if the water is boiling, if I have an egg in the pot and the water is boiling, and I'm trying to see what's in the pot. I can't see what's in the pot while the water is boiling. I got to wait for it to simmer down, right? So as if you're dealing with conflict in relationships, if you know that you are hot and you feel intense emotions, try to take a break from doing that in the moment, right? Um, Focus on finding common ground, understand different perspectives, and express your concerns and expectations. That last part, expressing your concerns and expectations, unfortunately, a lot of people have these expectations and concerns in their head. Sounds good and feels good in their head. We need to figure out ways to get it out, right? We got to make sure that we are getting it out. I had to put boundaries on my mother that she blew through. So we are no contact at the moment. So someone on YouTube says that they had to put bound, and I want to say that putting boundaries on a family member, especially a parent, is probably one of the hardest things you can do. But sometimes one of the most necessary things that you need to do, as I said at the beginning of the broadcast, dealing with family systems and family dynamics is so challenging because your parents are the first person that had access to you. That way that you've learned how to love, right? And so sometimes some of the love you've received from your caregiver, from your parent, was very dysfunctional, was very unhealthy. And as you became older, you started to understand, like, this is not okay. It's not okay that I'm being called out of my name. It's not okay that I'm being cussed out, right? There's some people that are adults, not even living in the same household, and their parent still treats them like trash. And because you've been so used to it, you don't even realize that it's happening because it's been your norm. And so being able to put the boundary up is important. And then being able to exercise it is important. But then sometimes if they're not adhering to your boundary, no contact is something you have to do. Don't listen to those people that say, "Oh, but that's your mother. Oh, that's this person," right? You can't that's this person, but what about me, right? And again, you go back to people who look at like blood's thicker than water mentality, which I get. It worked for a certain time maybe, but for when it comes to my mental health, that whole thing doesn't work for me, right? And so yes, especially for certain cultures, it may look like you're being a bad person. You may worry about what people are going to think. Do people have to walk in your shoes when you're dealing with that parent cussing you out, right? Or that a grandparent or that sister or that child, right? Sometimes even with people's adult children, they have to put up boundaries, and sometimes no contact. That has to be the hardest thing ever to do, right? You don't have kids and think like that would be the case, or you don't grow up and like love your parent and want so much from them and recognize that they're not able to deliver that. And so, you know what? When I say like the boundary, putting that up, yes, logically, you can know that that's important to do, but emotionally, it can feel hard to do. But remembering I got to do what's necessary for me to do so that I can be okay. She says it was to protect myself. She's a narcissist. She was never who I thought she was. Right. And so yeah, that's one of the hardest things that you can do. The last thing I want to say is, when you're struggling in navigating these complexities in relationships, it's okay to seek support around it. um Therapy obviously is a great resource. If there's a neutral party, that's great, to bring them in, and then just taking it one day at a time. We are all work in progresses. I'm a work in progress. Like, as long as we're still breathing, we're growing, we're evolving, we're learning, we're changing. And a lot of times when we are struggling, especially in relationships, a lot of people self blame themselves, or they're waiting around for other people. My goal and everything that I do is to help educate you on like why some of these things are happening, so you can start to really have patience with yourself as you're trying to change. The older we get, the harder it is to change. That's why kids can learn new languages early in their years as opposed to as an adult, right? So if you're not being patient with yourself, if you're beating yourself up for what you've allowed or what you are allowing as you're trying to change, you're essentially walking around with the bully, right? So I really want you to think about, how can I have patience with myself? How can I have grace with myself as I'm trying to navigate and evolve and grow and have peace? And on this journey, especially, as we're talking about boundaries and navigating relationships, and realizing that some people can't keep growing with you because they refuse to adhere to your boundaries, it can feel lonely. It can feel hard. There's a lot of grief that comes with it, because that means that I have to let some people go. Right. And that's the part people don't talk about. People can say, oh, just cut them off. Oh, just put your boundaries up. But understand that it's something that will feel really hard, and it can feel like you're grieving So I hope this was helpful. I hope this makes sense. If anything I ever say resonates for you, like understand that you have power to create change. But you have to really start to have faith to believe in yourself. If there's ever a topic that you want me to add on these Wednesday segments, all you got to do is go to my website and you can enter in the information. Go to celestetherapist.com, and then you'll be able to enter the information anonymously, and we will add it on to the queue for the topic. So thank you so much. Thank you, Kat. Pride Flower Pansexual. Thank you always. You are so welcome. Thank you for listening. Thank you for following me. If this resonates for you, share it with somebody that you love. Make sure you like, subscribe, share, and I will talk to you all later.